The lightning struck so close that Fiona Crawford felt the cabin shake to its foundation, and in that same instant, the first contraction seized her body with such force that she cried out into the empty darkness. She was alone, 9 months pregnant, and the storm that had been brewing all afternoon had finally descended upon the Idaho wilderness with a fury that seemed personal. Her husband Thomas had left 3 days ago to guide a wagon train through the mountain pass, promising to return before the baby came, but the child growing inside her had different plans. Fiona gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table, breathing through the pain as rain hammered against the cabin's wooden walls. The year was 1876, and their homestead sat 5 miles outside Snake River, Idaho, tucked into a valley where the forest met the foothills. It was beautiful country when the sun shone, but tonight it felt like the edge of the world, dark and threatening and impossibly far from help. She had been preparing supper when the first twinge hit her lower back. At first she had dismissed it as the usual aches of late pregnancy, but within an hour the twinges had become unmistakable. The baby was coming, and it was coming now. Fiona stumbled to the door and looked out at the storm, hoping against hope that she might see Thomas riding up the trail, but there was nothing but rain and wind and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the empty landscape. Another contraction came, stronger than the first, and Fiona knew she had to think clearly. She was a practical woman, raised on a farm in Ohio before heading west with Thomas 2 years ago. She had seen animals give birth, had even helped her own mother with her younger siblings' arrivals, but this was different. This was her own body, her own child, and she was utterly alone. She moved around the cabin, gathering what she would need. Clean linens, water from the barrel by the door, her sewing scissors washed and ready. The fire in the hearth was burning well, at least, giving both light and warmth. Fiona tried to remember everything her mother had told her, every piece of advice from the few women in Snake River she had befriended. Stay calm. Keep breathing. Trust your body. But her body seemed intent on tearing itself apart. The contractions were coming faster now, each one a rolling wave of pain that stole her breath and made her legs shake. Fiona sank onto the bed she shared with Thomas, bunching the quilts beneath her. The wind screamed around the cabin, and she screamed with it, no longer trying to hold back her voice. There was no one to hear her anyway. Except there was. Through the storm's chaos, she heard something else. Hoofbeats, heavy and purposeful, coming up the trail toward the cabin. Fiona's heart leaped. Thomas had come back. Thank God Thomas had come back. The door burst open, and a man stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and breathing hard. But it was not Thomas. The stranger was massive, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His hair was dark and long, hanging past his shoulders in wet ropes, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskins and furs, and his arms were bare despite the cold rain, showing muscles that looked carved from stone. His eyes, pale gray in the firelight, swept the cabin and landed on Fiona writhing on the bed. "Jesus," he breathed, and his voice was deep and rough. "Madam, are you hurt?" "The baby," Fiona gasped between contractions. "The baby is coming." The man stood frozen for a moment, water pooling at his feet. Then he seemed to gather himself. He shut the door firmly against the storm and crossed to the bed in 3 long strides. Up close, Fiona could see his face more clearly. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His hands, when he held them up uncertainly, were huge and calloused. "I'm Franklin Sawyer," he said, speaking slowly and clearly as if trying to keep his own panic at bay. "I was passing through when the storm hit. Saw your light. Madam, I do not know much about birthing babies." "Neither do I," Fiona said with a desperate laugh that turned into a cry as another contraction seized her. "This is my first." Franklin stood there for a moment longer, his gray eyes meeting hers. She saw him make a decision. He moved to the fire and began stoking it higher, then rolled up his sleeves and went to the water barrel. He washed his hands thoroughly, scrubbing them until they were red, and Fiona felt a flicker of hope. This man, whoever he was not going to run. "What is your name?" he asked, coming back to the bedside. Fiona Crawford." "All right, Fiona Crawford. I am going to help you through this." His voice was steady, and she clung to that steadiness like a lifeline. "Tell me what you need." Over the next hour, Franklin became her anchor in the storm. He brought her water when she was thirsty, held her hand when the contractions peaked, and spoke to her in that deep, calm voice that somehow cut through the pain. He had delivered calves and foals, he told her, and once helped a trapper's wife in the mountains when no one else was around. It was not the same as attending dozens of human births, but it was something. "You're doing fine," he kept saying. "You are strong. I can see it." Fiona wanted to laugh at that. She did not feel strong. She felt like she was being split in two, like her body was betraying her with every contraction. But Franklin's presence helped. He moved around the cabin with surprising efficiency for such a large man, gathering everything that might be needed. He laid out the clean linens, positioned the lamp so he could see better, and kept the fire roaring against the cold that seeped in through every crack. The storm raged on, and so did Fiona's labor. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Franklin stayed by her side the entire time, his hand gripping hers so tightly she thought their bones might fuse together. She was vaguely aware that she was probably crushing his fingers, but he never complained, never pulled away. "I cannot do this," she gasped at one point, exhausted beyond measure. "I cannot." "You can," Franklin said firmly. He leaned down so his face was level with hers, those gray eyes boring into her own. "You are the bravest woman I have ever seen, and you can do this. The baby is coming whether you think you can or not, so you might as well believe in yourself." It was not flowery or sweet, but it was exactly what Fiona needed to hear. She bore down with the next contraction, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. Franklin moved to the foot of the bed, and she saw his eyes widen. "I can see the head," he said, and there was wonder in his voice now. "Fiona, the baby is crowning. Just a little more." The next few minutes were the hardest of Fiona's life. She pushed with everything she had, feeling like she was turning herself inside out, while Franklin's voice guided her through it. Push, breathe, push again. The pain was enormous, all-consuming, but then suddenly it broke like a wave cresting, and she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's cry. "You have a son," Franklin said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "A healthy, beautiful son." Fiona collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. Franklin worked quickly, doing what needed to be done with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such large hands. He tied off the umbilical cord with clean string and cut it carefully, then wrapped the baby in one of the soft blankets Fiona had prepared. When he finally placed the tiny bundle in her arms, Fiona looked down at her son's scrunched red face and felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my sweet boy." Franklin stepped back, giving them space, but Fiona caught his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved us, both of us." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, ducking his head so his wet hair fell forward. "You did all the hard work. I just caught him." "You did more than that, and you know it." Fiona held his gaze until he nodded slightly. "Will you stay until the storm passes? Please. I know it is an imposition, but I will stay as long as you need me," Franklin said simply. He cleaned up while Fiona nursed her son for the first time, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and toes. The storm outside was finally beginning to ease, the thunder growing more distant. Franklin moved around the cabin quietly, and Fiona found herself watching him. There was something inherently good about this man, something solid and trustworthy. He had appeared out of nowhere, like an answer to a prayer she had not even spoken. When both mother and baby were settled and comfortable, Franklin finally allowed himself to sit down in the chair by the fire. He was still soaked from the storm, and Fiona directed him to Thomas's trunk where he could find dry clothes. Franklin changed quickly, though Thomas's shirts barely fit across his massive shoulders, and then made himself a bedroll on the floor near the hearth. "I'm sorry I do not have a better place for you to sleep," Fiona said. "This is luxury compared to where I usually lay my head," Franklin replied. "Do not worry about me. Rest while you can. That little one will have you up soon enough." Fiona tried to sleep, but every few minutes she found herself checking that the baby was still breathing, still real. Franklin seemed to sense her vigilance because he stayed awake too, feeding the fire and keeping watch through the night. Once she caught him looking at her and the baby with an expression of such longing that it made her heart ache. Morning came gray and damp, the storm finally spent. Fiona's body was sore in ways she had never imagined, but the baby was nursing well and seemed healthy. Franklin made breakfast from her supplies, and they ate together in the quiet cabin. "Where were you headed when the storm caught you?" Fiona asked. "Nowhere in particular," Franklin said, staring into his coffee. "I trap in the high country most of the year. Come down when I need supplies or when winter gets too hard even for me." "You live up there alone?" "Mostly. I prefer it that way." But he did not sound entirely convinced of his own words. Fiona wanted to ask more, but the baby started fussing, demanding attention. Franklin washed the dishes and then announced he should be going. Fiona felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving. "Your husband will be back soon, I imagine," Franklin said, not meeting her eyes. "He should not find a strange man in his house." "You are not a strange man. You are the man who delivered our son." Fiona stood carefully, still holding the baby. "Franklin, I do not know how I can ever repay you for what you did." "No payment needed." Franklin picked up his pack and headed for the door. He paused there, looking back. "What will you name him?" "I do not know yet. I need to wait for Thomas." But even as she said it, Fiona felt a pang. Thomas should have been here. It was not his fault, but Franklin was the one who had held her hand, who had caught their son as he entered the world. Franklin seemed to understand. "He's lucky to have you as a mother," he said quietly. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Fiona stood at the window and watched him saddle his horse, a large roan that looked as weathered and strong as its owner. Franklin mounted and rode off down the trail without looking back. She felt the strangest urge to call him back, to ask him to stay longer, but she did not. He had his life, and she had hers. Thomas returned that evening, full of apologies and explanations. The wagon train had been delayed by the storm, and he had ridden through the mud as fast as he dared. He was overjoyed to meet his son, marveling at the tiny, perfect features, but his joy was tempered by guilt. "I should have been here," he kept saying. "I should have been with you." "It is all right," Fiona soothed. "A man came by during the storm. He helped me through it." She told Thomas the whole story, and he listened with wide eyes. "Franklin Sawyer? I've heard that name. He is some kind of legend up in the mountains. Lives alone, comes down maybe twice a year. They say he can track anything and survive in conditions that would kill most men." Thomas shook his head in wonder. "You were lucky he happened by." "Yes," Fiona agreed softly. "Very lucky." Life settled into a new rhythm over the following weeks. The baby, whom they named Samuel, thrived. He was a healthy, hungry infant who demanded constant attention, but Fiona loved every exhausting moment. Thomas was attentive and helpful, taking on more of the chores so she could rest, and everything should have been perfect. But Fiona found her thoughts drifting back to that night in the storm. She remembered Franklin's calm gray eyes, his steady hands, the gentleness with which he had handled her newborn son. She remembered the longing in his face when he looked at them, and she wondered about the life he led alone in the mountains. It seemed impossibly lonely, and her heart ached for him in a way that confused her. She told herself she was just grateful, that was all. Anyone would feel the same about someone who had helped them through such an ordeal. But in quiet moments, when she was nursing Samuel by the fire, she found herself watching the trail outside, half hoping to see a large figure on a roan horse coming up the path. Thomas noticed her distraction. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked one morning. "You seem far away lately." "Just tired," Fiona said, forcing a smile. "Samuel does not sleep much at night." It was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was too complicated to examine, let alone explain. So Fiona pushed her thoughts aside and focused on being a good wife and mother. She had no business thinking about Franklin Sawyer. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. 2 months after Samuel's birth, Thomas came home with news. He had accepted another guiding job, this one taking a group of prospectors into the mountains for 3 weeks. The money was excellent, more than they could afford to turn down, but it meant leaving Fiona and the baby alone again. "I do not like it," Thomas admitted, "but we need the money to get through the winter, and you managed fine last time." "That was different," Fiona said. "I was not caring for an infant." "Mrs. Henderson said she could check on you, and it is just 3 weeks. Fiona agreed because she had to, because they needed the money and because Thomas had already given his word. So she kissed her husband goodbye and watched him ride off, feeling the familiar weight of solitude settle on her shoulders. The first week passed uneventfully. Samuel was growing bigger and stronger every day, and Fiona fell into the rhythm of caring for him alone. Mrs. Henderson did stop by twice, bringing food and company, but the older woman lived in Snake River proper and could not visit often. The second week brought the first snow of the season. It started as light flurries that dusted the ground, but by the third day it was coming down heavily. Fiona kept the fire high and stayed inside with Samuel, grateful for the supplies they had laid in. The world outside turned white and silent, beautiful but isolating. On the 10th day after Thomas left, Fiona woke to find the cabin unnaturally cold. The fire had gone out in the night, which had never happened before. She went to relight it and realized with growing dread that they were nearly out of firewood. Thomas had meant to split more before he left, but the job offer had come suddenly, and he had not had time. There was wood stacked outside, but it was buried under nearly a foot of snow now. Fiona bundled Samuel warmly and laid him in his cradle, then wrapped herself in every warm thing she owned and ventured out. The cold hit her like a physical blow. This was not the crisp cold of an autumn morning, but the deep, dangerous cold of mountain winter. She dug through the snow to reach the woodpile and began carrying logs inside, her hands going numb despite her gloves. It took a dozen trips to bring in enough for the day, and by the time she finished, Fiona was shaking with cold and exhaustion. She got the fire going again and huddled in front of it with Samuel, trying to warm up. That night the temperature dropped even further. Fiona woke every few hours to feed the fire, terrified of letting it die again. The cabin's chinks let in drafts of icy air, and frost formed on the inside of the windows. Samuel fussed and cried, disturbed by the cold, and Fiona held him close to her body, trying to share her warmth. By morning she knew she was in trouble. The wood she had brought in yesterday was nearly gone, and the thought of going back out into that cold made her want to weep. But she had no choice. The fire could not go out. She was in the middle of her second trip to the woodpile, arms full of logs and face numb with cold, when she saw the rider coming up the trail. For a wild moment she thought it was Thomas returning early, but the figure was too large, the horse too familiar. Franklin Sawyer rode into the clearing and dismounted in one smooth motion. He took in the scene at a glance. Fiona struggling with the firewood, the smoke coming weakly from the chimney, the desperate look in her eyes. "Get inside," he said, his voice cutting through the cold. "I will handle this." Fiona wanted to argue, to maintain some shred of pride, but she was too cold and too grateful. She stumbled back into the cabin and went straight to Samuel, who was crying in his cradle. By the time she had him soothed and nursing, Franklin had already made a half-dozen trips, stacking wood by the hearth until they had enough for days. He came in with the last load, stamping snow off his boots. He had added even more bulk since she last saw him, bundled in furs and leather, his beard longer and face weathered, but his eyes were the same, that clear gray that seemed to see everything. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked, and there was anger in his voice. "Where is your husband?" "Working," Fiona said defensively. "We needed the money." Franklin's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Instead, he set about making the cabin warmer, stuffing rags into the worst of the drafts and building up the fire until it roared. He melted snow for water and made a pot of coffee, and Fiona watched his efficient movements with a mixture of relief and confusion. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked. "I thought you stayed in the high country during winter." Franklin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I do," he said at last. "Usually. But I was passing by Snake River and heard your husband had headed into the mountains. Heard you were out here alone with the baby. I thought I would check on you." "You came all the way out here just to check on me?" He met her eyes then, and Fiona saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I could not stop thinking about you," he admitted roughly. "About that night. About you and the baby. I just needed to know you were all right." The air in the cabin suddenly felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. Fiona held Samuel a little tighter, as if the baby could protect her from the feelings stirring in her chest. "We are fine," she said, but her voice came out whisper, soft. "You're not fine. You are freezing and exhausted and trying to do too much alone." Franklin stood abruptly, moving to the door. "I will split more wood. You need a proper supply." He spent the rest of the day working outside, and Fiona watched him through the window when she could. His strength was evident in every swing of the axe, muscles bunching and releasing beneath his furs. He split enough wood to last weeks, then stacked it neatly under the eave where it would stay relatively dry. He fixed the worst of the drafts from the outside, packing mud and moss into the gaps between logs. He did not ask permission or expect thanks, he just did what needed doing. When he finally came back inside, the sun was setting and he was covered in snow and sweat. Fiona had hot food waiting, and Franklin ate like a man starving. They did not talk much during the meal, but the silence was comfortable, almost companionable. After dinner, Franklin showed signs of leaving. He gathered his pack and checked his gear, and Fiona felt panic rising again. "The snow is still heavy," she said quickly. "It is not safe to travel in the dark. You should stay the night." Franklin hesitated, clearly torn. "It would not be proper." "It was not proper last time either, but you stayed anyway." Fiona stood, still holding Samuel. "Please, Franklin, I will rest easier knowing you are not frozen on the trail somewhere." He agreed, and Fiona felt a relief disproportionate to the situation. Franklin made his bedroll by the fire again, and Fiona settled into bed with Samuel. But sleep did not come easily. She was hyper-aware of Franklin's presence, of his steady breathing, of the way he occasionally got up to tend the fire so she would not have to. In the morning, the snow had stopped, but the cold remained. Franklin stayed. He did not ask, and Fiona did not question it. They both simply accepted that he would not leave yet. He spent the day making improvements to the cabin, and Fiona focused on Samuel, but they moved around each other in an awkward dance, always aware, always careful not to touch. That night, Franklin told her stories of the mountains. He spoke of summers when the wildflowers covered entire meadows, of winters so harsh that even the wolves stayed in their dens, of the absolute silence that came with deep snow. He told her about learning to live off the land after his family died when he was 19, about choosing solitude because it seemed safer than risking more loss. "Do you ever get lonely?" Fiona asked softly. "Every day," Franklin admitted. "But lonely is better than heartbroken." Fiona understood that. She understood it better than she wanted to. Because sitting here with Franklin, listening to his deep voice in the firelight while her baby slept peacefully, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt seen. Thomas was a good man and a good husband, but he did not look at her the way Franklin did, like she was someone worth really knowing. The days began to blur together. Franklin stayed and Fiona stopped protesting. He slept by the fire and she slept in the bed, and during the days they worked side by side, caring for the cabin and for Samuel. Franklin proved surprisingly good with the baby, his large hands gentle as he held the small body, his deep voice soothing when Samuel fussed. "You would make a good father," Fiona said one afternoon, watching him walk Samuel around the cabin, the baby tiny against his broad chest. Franklin's expression darkened. "That's not likely to happen." "Why not? Surely there is some woman who would be happy to share your life." "What woman would want to live in the mountains, miles from anyone, married to a man who barely knows how to be around people anymore?" Franklin shook his head. "That's not a life to offer anyone." "You are selling yourself short," Fiona said firmly. "You are kind and strong and good. Any woman would be lucky to have you." Franklin looked at her then, really looked at her, and Fiona felt heat rise to her face. The moment stretched between them, heavy and full of possibility, until Samuel broke the tension with a loud cry. Franklin handed the baby to Fiona, their fingers brushing, and the contact sent a jolt through her entire body. This was dangerous. She was married. She loved Thomas. But she could not deny what she felt when Franklin was near, this pull that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. 2 weeks after Franklin had arrived, Thomas came home. Fiona heard the horse approaching and felt her stomach drop with a confusing mixture of relief and dread. Thomas burst through the door, covered in snow and grinning widely, but his smile faded when he saw Franklin sitting by the fire. "Sawyer," he said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" "Your wife was snowed in and running out of firewood," Franklin said, standing. "I came by to check on her and ended up staying to help." Thomas looked between them, and Fiona could see him trying to read the situation. "That was kind of you," he said finally. "I appreciate you looking after my family." "They needed looking after," Franklin said, and there was an edge to his voice that made the words almost an accusation. Fiona stepped between them before the tension could escalate. "Thomas, you must be freezing. Let me get you something hot to eat." She moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands, while the two men sized each other up like wolves circling territory. Franklin left that evening despite the late hour and the snow. He shook Thomas's hand, nodded to Fiona, and rode off into the darkness without looking back. Fiona watched him go and felt something tear inside her chest. "He is a strange one," Thomas said, coming to stand beside her at the window. "But I suppose we are lucky he happened by again." "Yes," Fiona said quietly. "Lucky." That night, lying in bed beside Thomas, Fiona stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through her tangled emotions. She had not done anything wrong. She had not touched Franklin beyond what was necessary, had not said anything that could not be said in front of Thomas. But she had felt things, wanted things, and that was almost worse. Thomas reached for her, and Fiona responded out of habit, out of obligation, out of a desperate need to prove to herself that her marriage was still solid. But when it was over, and Thomas fell asleep beside her, Fiona lay awake and thought of gray eyes and gentle hands, and a loneliness that matched her own. The winter deepened. Thomas was home more now, as most of the passes were closed until spring, and life returned to normal. Fiona threw herself into being a good wife and mother. She kept the cabin spotless, cooked elaborate meals, and doted on Samuel. She tried not to think about Franklin alone in his mountain cabin, but she failed more often than not. In February, a terrible cold snap hit the region. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid within minutes, and livestock died in their barns. Thomas had gone into Snake River for supplies and was trapped there for 3 days, unable to travel in the deadly cold. Fiona was alone with Samuel again, keeping the fire burning constantly and praying they had enough wood. On the second night, she heard something outside, not the wind, which was constant, but something else. Footsteps crunching through snow. Fiona grabbed the rifle Thomas kept by the door and called out, "Who is there?" "It is Franklin." Fiona threw open the door and found him standing there, looking half frozen. "What are you doing?" she cried. "You will die out in this." "I wanted to make sure you had enough wood," Franklin said through chattering teeth. "Knew Thomas was stuck in town." "You are insane. Get inside before you freeze to death." She pulled him in and shut the door, then helped him remove his frozen outer layers. His lips were blue and his hands were stiff, and Fiona's anger at his recklessness warred with overwhelming gratitude that he had come. She sat him by the fire and wrapped him in blankets, then made him drink hot coffee until color began to return to his face. "You could have died," she said, and her voice broke. "Why would you risk that?" Franklin looked at her, and all his defenses were down, stripped away by cold and exhaustion. "Because I cannot stop thinking about you," he said hoarsely. "Because I lie awake at night, worrying that something will happen to you and I will not be there. Because I am in love with you, Fiona, and I do not know what to do about it." The words hung in the air between them. Fiona felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She should tell him to leave. She should be horrified, offended, angry. But instead she whispered, "I know. I feel it too." Franklin closed his eyes like he was in pain. "You are married." "I know." "You have a child." "I know." "Then what are we supposed to do?" Fiona did not have an answer. She sat down beside him, careful not to touch, and they stayed like that for a long time, two people desperately in love and completely trapped by circumstance and honor. "I should go," Franklin said eventually, but he did not move. "You cannot. The cold will kill you." Fiona stood and went to check on Samuel, who was sleeping peacefully. When she turned back, Franklin was watching her with such naked longing that it hurt to see. "Stay until Thomas gets back, then we will figure out what to do." What they figured out was nothing. Thomas returned the next day, and Franklin left immediately. But something had shifted. Some line had been crossed, even though they had not touched beyond warming a frozen man by the fire. Fiona and Franklin both knew the truth now, and there was no unknowing it. The rest of the winter was torture. Fiona went through the motions of her life, but she felt like she was sleepwalking. Thomas noticed something was wrong and tried to fix it with small kindnesses and extra attention, which only made Fiona feel worse. She loved Thomas. He was her husband, the father of her child. But what she felt for him was comfortable and steady, not the burning, consuming thing she felt for Franklin. She did not see Franklin again until spring. The snow began to melt in March, and the world came back to life. Thomas resumed his guiding work, and one day when he was gone, Franklin appeared at the cabin. Fiona opened the door and they stared at each other, months of longing and denial between them. "I tried to stay away," Franklin said. "I tried, but I cannot. I need to see you, even if I cannot have you." "Franklin, this is impossible." "I know, but tell me you do not think about me. Tell me you are happy with your life, and I will leave and never come back." Fiona opened her mouth to say exactly that, to send him away and protect her marriage and do the right thing. But she could not lie, not to him. "I cannot tell you that," she whispered. Franklin stepped inside and closed the door. They stood close enough to touch but did not, the air between them crackling with tension. "What do we do?" he asked again, and his voice was raw with pain. "I do not know. Thomas is a good man. I owe him everything, and Samuel needs his father. I know. I would never ask you to leave him." Franklin ran a hand through his hair, frustration in every line of his body. "But I cannot keep living like this either, knowing you are here, wanting you and not being able to have you." "Then what do we do?" Fiona asked, tears spilling down her face. Before Franklin could answer, Samuel started crying from the bedroom. Fiona went to him automatically, and when she came back carrying the baby, Franklin was still standing in the same spot, looking lost. "He's getting so big," Franklin said softly, looking at Samuel with a sad smile. "He will be 6 months old next week." Franklin reached out and gently touched Samuel's soft hair, and the baby grabbed his finger with a surprisingly strong grip. Something in Franklin's expression cracked, and Fiona saw the depth of what this was costing him. He was not just in love with her, he loved Samuel too, this child he had brought into the world with his own hands. "I will go," Franklin said, gently extricating his finger from Samuel's grip. "I should not have come." "Wait," Fiona said desperately. She did not know what she wanted to say, only that she could not let him leave like this. "I am so sorry, Franklin. I wish things were different." "So do I, more than you know." He moved to the door, then paused. "If you ever need me, for any reason, send word to the trading post in Snake River. They know how to reach me. Promise me, Fiona, if you are ever in danger or need help, you will send for me." "I promise." He left, and this time Fiona knew it was really goodbye. She sank into the chair by the fire, holding Samuel tight, and let herself cry for the first time since the night he was born. Summer came, then autumn. Life went on because it had to. Fiona tended the garden and preserved food for winter and cared for Samuel, who was growing into a bright, curious boy. Thomas worked and provided and was home more often, and Fiona tried to be grateful for the life she had. She really did try. But at night, when everyone was asleep, she sometimes stood at the window and looked toward the mountains, wondering where Franklin was and if he ever thought of her. She imagined him in his solitary cabin, trapping and hunting and living alone, and her heart ached for both of them. In October, everything changed. Thomas came home early from a guiding job, and Fiona knew immediately something was wrong. His face was gray, and he was holding his left arm strangely. "Just a little accident," he said when she questioned him, but over the next few days it became clear it was more serious than that. He had fallen while crossing a rocky section, landing hard on his arm. He had thought it was just bruised, but now the whole arm was swollen and hot to the touch. By the 4th day, Thomas was feverish and barely coherent. Fiona knew infection had set in, and she was terrified. She loaded Samuel into the wagon and drove Thomas into Snake River, where the closest thing to a doctor was an old army surgeon who had settled there after the war. He examined Thomas and confirmed Fiona's fears. The arm was badly infected, and it was spreading. He cleaned and bound the wound, gave Fiona medicine to administer, and told her to pray. The next week was a nightmare. Thomas alternated between burning fever and bone-shaking chills. Fiona barely slept, caring for him and Samuel both, terrified she was going to lose her husband. Mrs. Henderson helped when she could, but there was only so much anyone could do. On the 8th day, Thomas's fever finally broke. The infection had been beaten, but the damage was done. His left arm was useless now, the muscles and nerves too damaged to recover. The surgeon said he was lucky to be alive, lucky they had not needed to amputate. But Thomas did not feel lucky. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and Fiona could see him calculating the ways his life had just changed. A man with one good arm could not guide wagon trains through mountain passes. He could not do half the jobs that had kept them fed and housed. The money Thomas had saved would not last long, and winter was coming again. "We will figure something out," Fiona kept saying, but Thomas just shook his head. "What am I going to do?" he asked one night. "I cannot provide for you and Samuel like this." "We will manage. Maybe you can find work in town, something that does not require both arms." But they both knew the options were limited. Snake River was not a big town, and jobs were hard to come by even for able-bodied men. The future, which had seemed challenging but manageable, now loomed dark and uncertain. It was Mrs. Henderson who first suggested it. She came by one afternoon in November, bringing food and company, and found Fiona in tears while Thomas sat silent and defeated. "Have you thought about selling the land?" the older woman asked gently. "Moving into town where Thomas could find easier work?" "This is our home," Fiona protested. "We built it ourselves." "I know, dear, but sometimes we have to make hard choices." Mrs. Henderson patted her hand. "There is no shame in accepting when things have changed." After she left, Fiona and Thomas talked seriously for the first time since his injury. Thomas wanted to sell the homestead and move, to find whatever work he could in Snake River, even if it meant swallowing his pride. Fiona argued for keeping the land, but her heart was not fully in it. How would they manage out here, 5 miles from town, with Thomas unable to do the heavy work? They were still debating when Franklin showed up. It was late November, and the first real snow of the season was falling when Fiona heard a horse outside. She opened the door to find Franklin dismounting, and the sight of him made her knees weak. She had not seen him in 8 months, and he looked thinner, harder, like the loneliness had carved pieces away from him. "I heard about Thomas," he said without preamble. "Heard about his arm. I wanted to see if you were all right." "How did you hear?" Fiona asked, pulling her shawl tighter. "People talk. Even in the mountains, news travels." Franklin looked past her into the cabin. "Can I see him?" Thomas was sitting by the fire, his injured arm in a sling. He looked up as Franklin entered, and something complicated passed between the two men. They had never been friends exactly, but there was a grudging respect. "Sawyer," Thomas said, "long way to come for a social call. I heard you were hurt, wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Unless you can grow me a new arm, I think I am beyond help." Franklin pulled up a chair and sat down. "What are your plans?" Over the next hour, Thomas told Franklin everything. The injury, the infection, the loss of work, their financial struggles, the discussion of selling the land. Franklin listened without interrupting, his gray eyes moving between Thomas and Fiona, taking in every detail. When Thomas finished, Franklin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do not sell the land." "We do not have much choice," Thomas said. "I cannot work it anymore." "Let me work it." The words came out firm and certain. "Let me work the land with you. I will do the heavy labor, and you can handle things that do not need 2 good arms. We split everything down the middle." Fiona's heart stopped. Thomas stared at Franklin like he had grown a second head. "Why would you do that?" Thomas asked slowly. "Because I am tired of living alone in the mountains, because I think I could do some good here, because you need help, and I am offering it." Franklin met Thomas's eyes steadily. "I'm not asking for charity. It would be a fair partnership. You have land and knowledge. I have strength and skill. Together, we could make this work." Thomas looked at Fiona, and she tried to keep her face neutral, to not let him see the wild hope and terror fighting inside her. Having Franklin here, seeing him every day, working beside him, would be both heaven and hell, but it would also solve their problems, at least the practical ones. "I need to think about it," Thomas said. "Fair enough. Think on it, and let me know." Franklin stood to leave, and Fiona walked him to the door. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked quietly, out of Thomas's earshot. Franklin looked down at her, and she saw the truth in his eyes. Because I cannot stand the thought of you struggling. Because even if I cannot have you the way I want, I can at least help keep you safe. Because I delivered Samuel, and that makes me responsible for him in a way. And because maybe, just maybe, being near you even as just a friend will be enough. Will it? Fiona whispered. Will it be enough for either of us? It will have to be. He left, and Fiona went back inside to face Thomas's questions, but Thomas surprised her. What do you think? He asked. I think we do not have many other options, Fiona said carefully, and Franklin is a good man. He proved that the night Samuel was born. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, There is something between you two, is there not? Fiona's breath caught. Thomas, I'm not a fool, Fiona. I see the way he looks at you. I see the way you look at him. Thomas's voice was sad, but not angry. Nothing has happened, I know that. You are too good a woman for that. But the feeling is there. Fiona could not lie, not about this. Yes, she whispered, the feeling is there. But I am your wife, Thomas. I made vows to you, and I have kept them. I know you have. Thomas reached out with his good hand and took hers. I know, and I'm not angry. I just want you to be honest with me. Do you love him? The question hung in the air. Fiona could lie, and Thomas might even believe her, but she was so tired of lying, even to herself. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face. I do. But I love you too, Thomas. Maybe not in the same way, but I do. Thomas nodded slowly. I love you too, Fiona. You are my wife, the mother of my son, and I will never willingly let you go. But I am also a practical man, and I can see what is right in front of me. My arm is destroyed. I cannot provide for this family the way I should. Franklin can. And whether I like it or not, having him here might be the only way we survive. So you will accept his offer? Yes. But Fiona, I need you to promise me something. Promise me that no matter what, you will not break your vows, that you will stay my wife. I promise, Fiona said immediately. Thomas, I would never. I know. I just needed to hear you say it. They sent word to Franklin that his offer was accepted, and he moved his things to the homestead before the heavy snows came. Thomas and Fiona gave him the small storage room off the main cabin, and Franklin set about making it livable. It was barely big enough for a bed and a trunk, but Franklin said it was more space than he was used to. The arrangement was awkward at first. Franklin and Thomas circled each other like wary dogs, figuring out how to work together. But gradually, they found a rhythm. Franklin handled the physical labor, splitting wood, repairing fences, managing the livestock they acquired. Thomas handled the planning and management, using his one good arm and his knowledge to guide their efforts. And Fiona kept the household running, cooking for 3 adults and caring for Samuel. It was not easy. There were moments of tension, times when Franklin and Thomas clashed over how to do something. And there was the constant underlying current of Fiona's feelings for Franklin, which did not diminish just because she was trying to ignore them. But there were good moments, too. Evenings when they all sat by the fire, talking and laughing. Mornings when Franklin played with Samuel, making the boy giggle with delight. Times when Thomas and Franklin worked in easy companionship, proud of what they had accomplished together. Winter settled in for real, and the 3 of them were trapped together in the close quarters of the cabin. Fiona had thought it would be unbearable, but somehow they made it work. Franklin was scrupulous about giving her and Thomas privacy, disappearing to his room or outside whenever possible. And Thomas seemed determined to prove he was still a husband, still a man, despite his injury. But late at night, when Thomas was asleep and Samuel was quiet, Fiona sometimes heard Franklin moving around in his room. She knew he was not sleeping any better than she was. She knew he was lying there, just a thin wall away, probably thinking about her the way she was thinking about him. It was a special kind of torture, and Fiona did not know how much longer any of them could sustain it. Spring came, and with it a sense of renewal. The partnership was working. They had made it through the winter with food to spare, and the land was showing signs of their combined efforts. Thomas seemed more at peace with his limitations, and Franklin seemed less haunted. They had settled into their roles, and from the outside, it probably looked like a successful arrangement. But everything fell apart on a warm day in April. Fiona was in the garden, planting seeds while Samuel played nearby. Thomas had gone into Snake River for supplies, and Franklin was supposed to be mending fences in the far pasture. Fiona was lost in thought, her hands in the dirt, when she heard footsteps behind her. "I thought you were working on the fences," she said without turning around. "I was. I finished early." Franklin's voice was rough, strained. "Fiona, we need to talk." She stood up and turned to face him, brushing dirt from her hands. Franklin looked anguished, his gray eyes stormy. "What is wrong?" "This," he said, gesturing between them. "All of this. I cannot do it anymore, Fiona. I thought I could, but I cannot." "What do you mean?" "I mean living here, seeing you every day, wanting you, and not being able to have you. It is killing me." Franklin took a step closer, and Fiona's breath caught. "I lie awake every night knowing you are just on the other side of that wall, sleeping beside him, and it tears me apart." "Franklin, we agreed." "I know what we agreed. I know you are married. I know this is wrong, but I do not think I can keep pretending anymore." They stood there, the spring sun warm on their faces, and Fiona felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. One more step, and everything would change forever. She should tell Franklin to stop, to remember his honor and hers. She should walk away right now. But she did not. "I do not want you to pretend," she whispered. Franklin made a sound that was half groan, half laugh. "Then what do you want, Fiona? Tell me. Tell me what you want, and I will do it or die trying." "I want you," she admitted, and saying it out loud felt like breaking a dam. "I have wanted you since the night Samuel was born, maybe before. I want you so much it hurts, Franklin, but I cannot have you. I made vows. Vows to a man you do not love the way you love me. That does not matter. They are still vows." Franklin closed the distance between them, and suddenly they were inches apart. Fiona could feel the heat coming off his body, could see the pulse beating in his throat. "It matters to me," he said fiercely. "It matters because life is short and brutal, and we do not get that many chances at happiness. And I am happy when I am with you, Fiona. I am alive in a way I have not been since I was a boy." "I am happy with you too," Fiona said, tears spilling over. "But that does not change anything." "It changes everything." Franklin reached up and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "Tell me you do not want this. Look me in the eye and tell me you want me to leave, to go back to the mountains and never come back. If you can do that, I will go. I swear it." Fiona tried to say the words. She opened her mouth, ready to send him away and do the right thing. But what came out was, "I cannot." Franklin kissed her. It was everything Fiona had imagined and more. His lips were warm and firm, and his hands in her hair were gentle despite their size. She kissed him back, all her longing and loneliness pouring into that kiss, and for a moment nothing else existed. Not Thomas, not her vows, not the impossibility of the situation, just Franklin and the way he made her feel whole. They broke apart, both breathing hard, and reality came crashing back. "Oh God," Fiona gasped, "what have we done?" "I'm sorry," Franklin said, but he did not look sorry. He looked fierce and alive and determined. "I'm not sorry. I should be, but I'm not. Franklin, this cannot happen again. I'm married. I know, and I will respect that. But Fiona, we need to figure this out. We cannot keep living like this." Before Fiona could respond, they heard a horse approaching. They jumped apart, and Fiona frantically wiped her eyes and smoothed her hair. Thomas came into view, the wagon loaded with supplies, and Fiona's guilt threatened to choke her. But then she looked at Thomas more closely. He was sitting oddly in the wagon, and his face was pale. As he got closer, Fiona saw blood seeping through his shirt. "Thomas!" She ran to the wagon, Franklin right behind her. "What happened?" "Ambush," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "Road agents. They tried to rob me, but I fought back, took a knife to the ribs before I could get away." Franklin lifted Thomas out of the wagon as easily as if he weighed nothing and carried him into the cabin. They got him onto the bed, and Fiona cut away his shirt to reveal a nasty knife wound in his side. It was deep and bleeding heavily, and Fiona's medical training, limited as it was, told her this was serious. "Go to Snake River and get the surgeon," Fiona told Franklin urgently. "Ride hard. Thomas needs help now." Franklin did not hesitate. He was on his horse and gone within minutes, pushing the animal to its limits. Fiona worked to stop the bleeding, packing the wound with clean cloth and praying she was doing the right thing. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, and Samuel cried from his cradle, sensing the tension. It felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes before Franklin returned with the old surgeon. The doctor examined Thomas, cleaned and stitched the wound, and gave Fiona instructions for his care. The knife had missed anything vital, but Thomas had lost a lot of blood, and infection was a serious risk. For the second time, Fiona spent days nursing Thomas through a crisis, and for the second time, Franklin was there, helping with everything that needed doing. He cared for the animals, kept the household running, and watched over Samuel when Fiona could not. He was a rock, steady and reliable, and Fiona found herself leaning on him more than she should. Thomas recovered slowly. The wound healed cleaner than his arm had, but it left him weakened. Between his useless arm and his injured ribs, he was a shadow of the man he had been. And Fiona could see it eating at him, this loss of strength and capability. One night, about 2 weeks after the attack, Thomas called both Fiona and Franklin to his bedside. He looked tired and sad, but also strangely peaceful. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about everything, about my injuries, about the future, about the three of us." Fiona's heart started pounding. Had he seen the kiss? Did he know? "I am not blind," Thomas continued. "I know what is between you two. I have known for a long time, and I have been lying here thinking about what is fair, what is right." "Thomas, nothing happened," Fiona started, but he held up his hand. "Let me finish. Please." Thomas took a breath. "I am a broken man. I cannot provide for you and Samuel the way a husband should. I cannot protect you. Hell, I can barely protect myself, as this latest adventure proved, but Franklin can do all those things." "Where is this going?" Franklin asked, his voice cautious. "I want to propose something. Something that might sound insane, but hear me out." Thomas looked at each of them in turn. "Fiona, I am giving you your freedom. I'm going to leave, go back east where I have family. They will take care of me. And you can marry Franklin, make a real life with him here on this land." "No," Fiona said immediately. "Thomas, no, I am not abandoning you. You are not abandoning me. I am releasing you. There is a difference." Thomas reached for her hand with his good one. "I love you, Fiona. I always will. But I can see that you love him more, and I am not so selfish as to hold you to vows that make you miserable. You deserve to be happy. And Samuel deserves a father who can actually care for him." "I am your wife," Fiona said, tears streaming down her face. "That means something." "It does. It means I care enough about you to let you go." Thomas looked at Franklin. "Will you take care of them? Will you give them the life they deserve?" Franklin was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I will love them and protect them with everything I have for as long as I live. You have my word." "Then it is settled." But it was not settled, not for Fiona. She argued and pleaded and cried, but Thomas was immovable. His mind was made up. He would leave for the East as soon as he was strong enough to travel, and he would send papers for a divorce, one of the few things the territorial courts would grant on grounds of abandonment and mutual agreement. "I am not doing this to hurt you," Thomas said one night when they were alone. "I am doing it because I love you. Can you understand that?" Fiona thought about it for a long time, about the year they had been married, about the good times and the hard times, about the baby they had created together. And slowly, painfully, she began to understand. Thomas was giving her a gift, perhaps the greatest gift one person could give another. He was setting her free. "I understand," she whispered, "and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Thomas." "Do not be sorry. Just be happy. That will be enough for me." Thomas left in May, as soon as his wounds had healed enough for travel. Franklin gave him money for the journey and promised to send more once they sold some livestock. The three of them stood outside the cabin, an awkward little family saying goodbye. "Take care of my son," Thomas said to Franklin. "Teach him to be a good man." "I will." Thomas kissed Samuel's forehead, then turned to Fiona. They looked at each other for a long moment, acknowledging everything that had been and everything that would never be. Then Thomas kissed her cheek gently. "Be happy," he said. "That is all I ask." "I will try. And Thomas, thank you for everything." He nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away. Fiona watched until he disappeared from sight, and she felt both grief and relief. An entire chapter of her life was closing, and a new one was beginning. Franklin put his arm around her shoulders, and for the first time she leaned into him without guilt. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I do not know. Ask me again in a few months." They waited a year before marrying, wanting to do things properly and give Thomas time to send the divorce papers. It was a strange year, living together but not really together, rebuilding the homestead, and raising Samuel as partners, but not yet as man and wife. Franklin moved into the main bedroom, but slept on the floor, insisting on propriety until they could wed legally. The papers came in March of 1878, and they married in a quiet ceremony in Snake River. Mrs. Henderson stood as witness, and Samuel, now 2 years old, toddled around their feet during the vows. It was nothing like Fiona's first wedding, which had been a big church affair with her whole family present. This was simple and small and perfect. Their wedding night was everything Fiona had dreamed of and more. Franklin was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt cherished. When he finally made love to her, it was with a tenderness that made her weep. This was what she had been missing, this connection that went beyond bodies to something deeper. "I love you," Franklin whispered against her hair afterwards. "I have loved you since the night I delivered Samuel, maybe even before that, from the moment I saw you in pain and scared and still so brave." "I love you too," Fiona said. "I think I always will." Life settled into a new rhythm. Franklin and Fiona worked the homestead together, and it thrived under their combined efforts. Samuel grew strong and healthy, calling Franklin Papa with innocent joy. And slowly, carefully, they built a life that was truly theirs. In the spring of 1879, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. She had hoped and feared this news in equal measure, remembering the terror of Samuel's birth. But Franklin held her close and promised that this time would be different. "No storm," he said with a small smile. "No panic, just you and me in a warm cabin. We can do this." And they did. Their daughter was born on a clear September day with the midwife from Snake River in attendance. But it was Franklin who caught the baby as she entered the world, just as he had caught Samuel. He placed the tiny girl in Fiona's arms with tears streaming down his face. "She is perfect," he breathed, "just like her mother." They named her Rose, and she was the image of Fiona with Franklin's gray eyes. Samuel adored his baby sister, and Fiona watched her 2 children together and felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. Over the next few years, their family grew. Another son in 1881, named James, then twin girls in 1883, Emma and Grace. The cabin that had once held just Fiona and Thomas now overflowed with children and love and life. They had to add rooms, expanding until the small homestead became a real ranch. Franklin proved to be everything Fiona had known he would be: a devoted husband, a loving father, a hard worker who made their land prosper. He taught Samuel and James to hunt and trap, to read the weather and respect the mountains. He taught the girls to ride and rope, believing daughters should be just as capable as sons. And he loved Fiona with a steady, constant devotion that never wavered. They heard from Thomas occasionally. He had married again, a widow back east, and seemed content with his new life. He never asked about Samuel, and Fiona thought that was for the best. Samuel knew Franklin as his father in every way that mattered, and dredging up the past would only hurt him. In 1885, when Samuel was 9 years old, he asked Fiona a question that she had been dreading. "Mama, why does Papa look so different from me?" Fiona and Franklin exchanged glances. They had always planned to tell Samuel the truth when he was old enough to understand, but the moment still caught her off guard. That night, after the other children were in bed, they sat Samuel down and told him everything. About Thomas, about the storm, about how Franklin had delivered him and later married Fiona. Samuel listened quietly, his young face serious. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So Papa Franklin is not my real father?" "He is your real father in every way that counts," Fiona said firmly. "He has raised you and loved you and cared for you since the day you were born." "But my birth father is Thomas Crawford?" "Yes." Samuel thought about this. "Is he a good man?" "Yes," Franklin said. "He's a good man who made a hard choice because he loved your mother enough to let her be happy." "Then I hope he is happy too." Samuel looked at Franklin. "But you are my papa. You are the one I want." Franklin pulled Samuel into a fierce hug, and Fiona saw tears on her husband's face. "I am honored to be your papa," Franklin said roughly. "So honored." The years passed in the way of all lives, with joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. The ranch prospered, the children grew. And through it all, Franklin and Fiona built a love that was tested and proven, forged in the fires of hardship and impossibility. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Fiona thought about that night so long ago when she had been alone and scared and in labor during a storm. She thought about the massive stranger who had burst through her door and proceeded to change her entire life. She thought about how one night, one moment of crisis, had led to everything she now held dear. "What are you thinking about?" Franklin asked one such evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, while the sounds of their children playing drifted from inside the house. "The night Samuel was born," Fiona admitted. "About how terrified I was, and how you appeared like some kind of miracle." Franklin took her hand, his large, rough fingers intertwining with hers. "I was the one who received the miracle that night. I found you." "We found each other." Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder, content. "And I would not change a single moment of it, not even the hard parts." "Neither would I." They sat like that as darkness fell, two people who had found their way to each other through storm and struggle and love. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, the same mountains where Franklin had once lived alone. But he was not alone anymore, and neither was Fiona. They had each other, and they had built something beautiful together. In 1890, when Samuel was 14, Thomas died back east. His wife wrote to inform them, and Fiona felt a pang of old grief. He had been a good man, and he had given her a precious gift twice over, first in Samuel, and second in letting her go. "Should we tell Samuel?" she asked Franklin. "Yes, he deserves to know." Samuel took the news quietly. He had never met Thomas, but he seemed to understand the significance of the man who had brought him into the world, and then stepped aside. "Can we plant a tree for him?" Samuel asked. "Something to remember him by?" So they planted an oak tree on the edge of their property, and the whole family gathered to say a few words. Franklin spoke about sacrifice and honor, and Fiona spoke about gratitude and forgiveness. The children stood quietly, even little Grace, understanding that something important was happening. That night, Franklin held Fiona close in their bed. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked. "None," Fiona said truthfully. "What about you?" "Only that I wasted so many years alone before finding you. But everything after that has been exactly right." Fiona kissed him, this man who had delivered her baby with his own 2 hands in the middle of a storm, who had loved her from that night forward with unwavering devotion, who had built this life with her piece by piece. He was her rock, her love, her everything. The children grew and eventually began leaving to start lives of their own. Samuel married a girl from Snake River and started his own ranch nearby. James became a deputy marshal. Rose married a doctor and moved to Boise. The twins stayed close to home, marrying brothers from a neighboring ranch and building houses within sight of their parents' land. Through all of it, Franklin and Fiona remained each other's constant. They grew older together, their bodies showing the wear of hard frontier life, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by shared experiences and weathered by time. In 1905, they celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and a growing collection of grandchildren. The ranch was still thriving, though Franklin had turned over most of the heavy work to Samuel and James. He and Fiona spent their days enjoying the fruits of their labor, tending a large garden and spoiling their grandchildren. "Can you believe it has been almost 30 years since that night?" Fiona said, watching their family gathered around the dinner table. "Best night of my life," Franklin said, "even if I was terrified the entire time." "You were terrified? You seemed so calm." I was faking it. Inside, I was praying harder than I ever had in my life. Franklin smiled at her, his gray eyes still sharp despite his age. But I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every hardship, every joy. All of it was worth it to have this life with you. I feel the same way. Fiona took his hand, noting how both their hands were weathered now, marked by decades of work and love. You know what I think about sometimes? That storm. How it was the worst storm I had ever seen, but it brought me the best thing in my life. Storms do that sometimes, Franklin said. They tear everything apart, but they also clear the way for something new to grow. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Franklin and Fiona sat on their porch one more time, looking at the mountains in the moonlight. The same mountains where Franklin had once lived alone, where he had learned to survive and to be self-sufficient. But those solitary days were long behind him now. "Thank you," Fiona said suddenly. "For what?" "For everything. For stopping at our cabin that night, for delivering Samuel, for staying, for loving me through all the impossible parts until we could be together properly, for building this life with me." Fiona leaned against him. "For being exactly who you are." Franklin wrapped his arm around her, and they sat in comfortable silence. The years had been good to them, despite the hard beginning. They had built something lasting, something real, something worth all the struggle and waiting. Their grandchildren would grow up hearing the story of how Grandma Fiona's labor started in the middle of a storm, and how their Grandpa Franklin delivered baby Samuel with his own 2 hands. They would hear about the year of waiting, about the sacrifice and the choices that led to the family they all belonged to. And they would understand that sometimes love was not simple or easy, but it was always worth fighting for. As Fiona and Franklin sat together under the stars, watching the life they had built sleeping peacefully around them, they knew they had done exactly that. They had fought for their love, had waited for it, had honored it through all the complications and difficulties. And in the end, they had won. The mountains stood silent witness to their love story, to the storm that had brought them together and the decades that had proven their commitment. And if mountains could speak, they would tell of a massive mountain man with gentle hands and a brave woman who gave birth in a storm, and how the two of them built something beautiful from the chaos. Years continued to pass in quiet contentment. Franklin's hair turned fully gray, then white, but his strength never entirely left him. Even in his 70s, he could still split wood and lift his great-grandchildren onto his shoulders. Fiona's hair also silvered, and her hands grew more gnarled with age, but her spirit remained as fierce and loving as ever. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, surrounded by 4 generations of family. The ranch had been divided among their children, but the original cabin still stood, carefully preserved. During the anniversary celebration, Franklin led Fiona back to that cabin, to the room where Samuel had been born so many years ago. "I remember every moment of that night," Franklin said, his voice still deep despite his age. "The terror on your face when I first walked in, the strength you showed through every contraction, the sound of Samuel's first cry, and the way you looked at me with such gratitude and trust." "I fell in love with you that night," Fiona confessed. "I did not realize it then, but looking back, I think my heart knew before my mind did. You were everything I needed, even though I could not have you yet. We got here eventually. That is what matters." Franklin pulled her close, and they stood in the cabin where their story had truly begun. And it was worth every moment of waiting. They lived several more years in peace and happiness, watching their family grow and prosper. When Franklin finally passed in his sleep at the age of 82, Fiona held his hand and thanked him one last time for that stormy night when he had burst into her cabin and her life. She told him she would see him again someday, and she would be waiting. Fiona lived another 3 years without Franklin, cared for by her children and surrounded by love. She spent those years telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the wild early days, about storm births and mountain men, and love that overcame impossible odds. And when she finally joined Franklin, she was buried beside him on the land they had built together, beneath the oak tree planted for Thomas. The ranch continued through the generations, and the story of Franklin and Fiona became family legend. Every child born into that family grew up knowing how their great-great-grandmother's labor started in the middle of a storm, and how their great-great-grandfather delivered the baby with his own two hands. They learned about sacrifice and honor, about love that waited and endured, about building something lasting from the chaos of life. And in quiet moments, when storms rolled through the Idaho mountains, some family members swore they could feel Franklin and Fiona watching over them, still together, still in love, their story woven forever into the land they had made their own. The ranch house that eventually replaced the original cabin had a plaque by the door, installed by Samuel before his own death. It read simply, "Built on love and delivered by storm, the Sawyer family home." And every person who passed through those doors understood that they were part of something bigger than themselves, part of a legacy that began with one terrifying night and two people brave enough to love against all odds. The mountains remembered, the land remembered, and the family remembered, passing the story down through generations, ensuring that Franklin and Fiona's love would never be forgotten. It was a story of the Wild West, of survival and strength, but most of all, it was a story of love, the kind of love that delivers babies in storms, that waits through impossible circumstances, that builds families and ranches and legacies that last forever. And every time a storm rolled through Snake River, Idaho, the descendants of Franklin and Fiona would pause and remember that sometimes the worst storms bring the greatest blessings, that sometimes a stranger appearing in the night is not a threat, but a miracle. And that sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected moments, and when it does, you hold on with both hands and never let go. The story lived on, as true and lasting as the mountains themselves, a testament to two people who found each other in chaos and built something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. Their love had started with a storm and a birth, but it had grown into something that could weather any storm, survive any hardship, and last beyond death itself. And that, their descendants knew, was the truest kind of love. There was the kind delivered by a mountain man's own two hands in the middle of a storm, the kind that changed everything and created a legacy that would never fade.